What will mankind choose to make of himself as a species? The vast majority, upwards of 98% of all forms of life that have ever existed on this planet over the previous few billions of years of life, have gone extinct, never to be seen again. Though perhaps a cruel reality, this has not been a pointless process. The development of life within the galaxy has been a process of successive stages of advancement, seen in the increases in the energy flux density of both the individual forms of life and of the biosphere as a whole. Each new stage brings a new power of life to expand its reach, but this depends upon the creation of certain preconditions by the previous activity of life. And with the emergence of each new state, we see the elimination of the previous one, and the great kills we call mass extinctions. So there is no balance of nature, there never was and there never will be. For life, as for the universe generally, there is only a process of anti-entropy. The vast majority of all life on land and in the oceans ultimately depends upon photosynthesis. To follow a generalized example, start with a large field which produces 1,000 tons of grass. Now this will be enough food to support a population of 27 million grasshoppers for about a year. And these 27 million grasshoppers can, in turn, be enough food themselves to support a population of 90,000 frogs. These 90,000 frogs can then sustain 300 trout, and these 300 trout can feed a single person for a year. This is a simplified picture of the highly narrowing pyramid of activity required to support higher forms of life. Now, in standard ecological studies, using thermodynamic considerations, we can find breakdowns of how the biological matter, or biomass, flows between different types of organisms in this process. First, for every amount of food that gets eaten, only a certain percentage is actually absorbed by the organism, while the rest is excreted as waste. And if we ignore the waste for now, we also see that of the food that gets absorbed, only a certain percentage becomes incorporated as new biomass of the organism's body, while the rest is actually used up by its metabolism. But different organisms will perform differently in this respect. For example, in terms of averages, warm-blooded vertebrates, such as birds and mammals, will only convert somewhere in the range of 1 to 3% of the absorbed food into new biomass of their bodies, while all the rest of their food is required just to maintain their existing biomass because of their high metabolic requirements, such as maintaining a constant body temperature. Cold-blooded vertebrates, such as reptiles or amphibians, have much lower metabolic requirements, meaning less food is required to maintain their bodies. A higher percentage, somewhere in the range of 10 to 25% of the food they absorb, becomes new biomass for them. Now, what do these ratios actually tell us? The numbers might suggest that animal life became increasingly less efficient in the evolution from insects to amphibians and reptiles and up through mammals. But in fact, not all biomass is created equal. As we will see, the quantitative difference in the energy use between organisms of different classes of vertebrates reflects important qualitative changes in the biosphere as a whole through evolutionary time. Recalling the broad-based pyramid of life required to sustain the most advanced organisms, take this top level as generally expressing the potential of the biosphere to sustain advanced forms of life. Now, take this investigation back through the fossil record, examining the stages of development of vertebrate life on land. The first form was that of the amphibians, which ruled the land for around 100 million years. These early amphibians were far from those you find in your backyard. Many even developed into alligator-like forms, the largest species even reaching lengths of up to 30 feet. And they dominated the open oceans, the coastlines, the freshwater systems, and onto land, at least as far as they could reach. Building up to the end Permian mass extinction, the reign of the amphibians gave way to the reign of the reptiles, which had emerged prior but did not fully dominate until the period following this mass extinction. The Mesozoic era of the reptiles had a few distinct phases, building to the dramatic reign of the dinosaurs, which was then famously halted with the Cretaceous Tertiary, or KT, mass extinction, and the age of the mammals began, lasting up to the present. Now think of the question of the energy throughput of these successive reigning classes of animals. Instead of blindly looking at the animal with your eyes, imagine the processes that actually create and sustain the animal. First, there is respiration. Inhaling one compound and exhaling another, forming a continuous exchange of material in and out of the organism. Then think of the consumption of food and water and the organism's excretion as a similar process. What we end up seeing is that every living organism exists as a continuous exchange within the biosphere. When we drop the assumptions of our senses, what we see is that each organism is not a discrete object, but a singularity within a continuous flow, like the whirlpool, which is an object which exists only as a continuous flow of water. In other words, the metabolic energy of an individual organism reflects the biogeochemical energy of its total environment. The average amphibians have a lower metabolic rate than comparative reptiles of a similar size, which means that the reptiles actually require more food and oxygen to sustain their activity. Then, comparing the reptiles with the mammals, the average mammals have a metabolism roughly 10 times higher than that of reptiles. This is what we know, at least, of the currently existing members of these successive classes. In attempting to fill in this process over evolutionary time, we must note that the metabolism of dinosaurs is still a hot topic of debate. There is both physiological evidence provided by their fossils, as well as temperature-dependent isotope ratios in their bones and teeth, which both indicate that they had some degree of warm-bloodedness, though probably not the same as we find in birds and mammals. The best estimates are that dinosaurs probably fell somewhere between the metabolic levels we find in reptiles and mammals today. So even though we don't know the exact values for these creatures from tens and even hundreds of millions of years ago, taking estimates from the fossil record and what we have of their descendants alive today is enough to see that each stage expresses successive levels of upshifts in the energy flux density of the organisms. But this obviously expresses more than simply a quantitative statement of energy requirements. The successive systems of life clearly display qualitative transformations in their relationship with the surrounding environment. The amphibians were very closely bounded to water. Their penetration into even moderately dry environments of land was limited by their moist skin and their mode of reproduction. They laid their eggs in the water, which then hatched into aquatic forms and went through a water-based metamorphosis cycle, all before they could return onto the land. The reptiles, having higher metabolic requirements, brought with them the first land-based eggs. This, along with their watertight skin, gave them a greater reach on land. But they were still cold-blooded, and thus their activity was still enslaved to the temperature of the environment. As the temperature dropped, so too did their activity. Likely in some early developments with dinosaurs, and then more dramatically with the emergence of mammals and birds, warm-blooded organisms were able to further free themselves from environmental restrictions, as they were able to maintain high rates of activity even in colder climates. The higher rate of metabolic activity of mammals is also able to sustain larger brains and more brain activity. But what did it take to support this new transformation in life's relationship with the environment? Take the most recent mass extinction, the KT extinction of 65 million years ago. This was not simply the replacement of dinosaurs with mammals, but was a transformation of the entire system of life. This is seen perhaps most dramatically at the base of the food chain. For the time of the dinosaurs, the plant life on land was dominated by gymnosperms, which had earlier brought the first seeds onto land, but had no flowers or fruit. The gymnosperm leaves were limited in their nutrition, as they often contain high levels of indigestible chemicals and resins. So the herbivore dinosaurs had to not only eat a lot to get energy, but they also must have had to invest much of their metabolic activity toward the digestion of the nutrient-poor food. The amazingly small brains of many, especially earlier dinosaurs, is then not a surprise, as their digestion requirements must have left little for the energy-expensive activity of large brains. Now, building up to the KT shift, a new form of plant life had emerged, the modern angiosperms. Their takeover was a perfectly timed, necessary precondition for the higher metabolic requirements of the mammalian system. The angiosperms not only provided more nutritious leaves, but also were the first to produce energy-dense fruits and nuts, providing the type of food source required to support both the higher metabolic activity and larger brain activity of the mammals and birds. Now, what becomes even more interesting is that we see this shift just as clearly when we look at the changes in the oceans, where the main photosynthetic producers of the seas went through their own shift during the exact same time frame. Unlike the large plants on land, the vast majority of the photosynthesis in the oceans is done by tiny single-celled organisms called phytoplankton. Believe it or not, they actually produce just as much new living matter as all the plants on the land. So the vast majority of all life in the oceans, from octopods to fish to sharks to whales, is ultimately all supported by the activity of these single-celled creatures. During the age of the dinosaurs, in addition to the long-standing role of cyanobacteria, the photosynthesis of the oceans was dominated by two specific forms of phytoplankton, called coccolithophores and dinoflagellates. At the KT shift, they both immediately started a long-term decline, and a new form of phytoplankton, which had emerged earlier, the diatoms, now took over the oceans. With the upshift to the diatoms at the base of the food chain, we see an upshift in the entire ocean food web, with more forms of ocean life, greater diversity, and higher overall energy consumption. Supported by this base of more advanced photosynthetic activity both in the ocean and on land, there was a transformation of vertebrate life across the board. Throughout both fresh waters and oceans, the more shark-like fish known as the holosti, which dominated the Mesozoic, were replaced at the KT by the more modern fish we are familiar with today. And on land, we see the familiar extinction of the dinosaurs, and the mammals initiating their reign over the planet 65 million years ago. Because the evolution of the biosphere is a constantly creative process, it demands constant technological leaps in the energy flux density of the system as a whole. New species with new biological characteristics emerge with these leaps, but no animal species has ever shown the ability to willfully change its behavior to the same effect. As the system evolves, species rise and fall, and most are never seen again. Through it all, the biogeochemical energy across the entire planet has constantly increased, never going backwards and never remaining static. This entire creative process has been vectored toward the bringing into being of a higher power of creativity inherent in the universe, that of mankind. Unlike all previous periods of evolutionary history, we have now reached a point where the further evolution of the biosphere is dependent on the willful action of man. Only man has shown the power to successively redefine his own relationship within the universe through his willful discovery and utilization of ever higher levels of energy flux density and higher economic platforms. But if we refuse that destiny, we will doom mankind to the extinction guaranteed to all forms of simply animal life. As the biosphere and the universe generally continues to move forward, only mankind has demonstrated the potential to decide to be a willful driver of that process, to be a continuous creator, to be an immortal species.